I'm now working on the front axle of the Dion truck, and what I've made so far is I've made this yoke. So you can see this is the part of the front axle that supports the kingpin, and you can see that arrangement here. And then I've also made this 8mm diameter length of brass with a 4mm hole in the centre. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to fix those two together, and then I'll machine away the excess to get the yoke. I'll back in a minute. Well, as you can see here, I've now silver soldered that piece of tube onto the end of my steering yoke, and all that remains now is for me to machine away the inside so that I end up with two 5mm pieces on the end and the centre all machined away, and that's what I'm about to do now. And as you can see here, I've now machined the part, and I've got that component there, which you can see in the diagram, which is the front yoke for the kingpin and axle and steering piece. Just got to make the other one now. And having made the second yoke in the fashion described previously, what I've now done is I've put the centre section of the steering at the front axle in, so the axle is almost complete. What I've got to do now is, in a position here and here, I've got to make some plates for the spring bolts and for the spring to rest on, and that's the next task I'll be doing on this particular axle. After that, it will be making the kingpin assemblies. So here is the front axle again. As you can see, I've now made the plates and fixed them to the front axle. These plates essentially will be the plates that attach to the spring. So they're all done and silver soldered in, and I've moved on and started making the rotating parts, the stub axles and the rotating parts for the steering. So what you can see here is, in essence, I've made a tube which is drilled with a 4mm centre hole. It's got a little stub on the end which I machined and silver soldered on. And then there's a steering arm, and this actually, you can see this piece here. Just get that into the light. So this piece here is part of the steering mechanism. There's one on the other side, and in effect there will be a bar going between there and there, which will allow them to work in unison when you see them. And on the end here is the connection, which is the steering rod going back to the steering box. I believe on the real vehicle that there's actually one long kingpin which would go down here, but again, due to scaling issues, I have to consider how I'm going to mount axles and various things. So what I've done, and it's a feature of some early cars that I've come across before, is I've actually made these. You can see that one there. It's a threaded shaft, and you can see here that's the top of the shaft. I threaded these components to 5mm, and I've got a 4mm end turned. You can see that on there. So in essence, the moving component of the steering is held in by two small stubs, and that leaves me clear to get a good fix on the stub axle that will go in. Problem with only using a small amount for the stub axle is it's very, very difficult to get it aligned. So here in fact is a wheel with the stub axle in it, so that will pull out. You can see that's the axle. It's a 5mm axle in the wheel going down to 4mm in the shaft. So that goes on there. I'm not sure whether I've got the right side, but then essentially, as you can see there, that goes onto there. The wheel is clear of the steering mechanism, you can see there, and I'm ready to go really with with building the rest of the steering mechanism for the front axle, and that's what I'm going to get onto next. So there it is, the front axle with the steering components. I've got the shafts, stub axle shafts, and the holders done for both sides, so it's just a case now of building the other components. And then I haven't assembled the springs yet, but I have cut them all, but I haven't assembled them. So one of the next things to do will be to assemble the springs, and then I'll fit the whole thing together and mount it onto the chassis to test fit it all. Carrying on with the front axle, I've got to make the steering linkages. So I've made two little components, you can see here, for the fix bar that goes between the two wheels, and in essence they will go on the end of this 2mm steel bar. So that's those two completed. The more complex piece though is making a swivel joint for the other end. So what I've done there is I've made this component. You may not be able to see, but it's domed on the top, and I've got this commercially available ball joint, and as you can see that fits in there and moves nicely. So this will go on the end of there. I've got this tube here, and to go in that I've made a small counterpart for the, it's not very clear in the focus, for the ball joint to go on. So that will go in there, and I simply drop that in the tube in the right way. So that goes in the tube like that. There is a screw component which again has got a little recess to go onto the spring. I'm just going to push that spring further up. Okay, I've got this little component that goes on the end. If I can screw it on, it's going to come out a little bit. This is proving to be okay. And as you can see now, what I've effectively got, I'm going to use this chop, is a spring-loaded component there. And then I install the ball joint. Okay, so that's in there. And then eventually the component is completed by pushing that in there to the right length. And I now have a working ball joint. As you can see there, it moves around. And this is required on the wheel end of the steering rod. On the other end, it's simply it's another one of these, because the steering box is vertical with an arm. So basically, as a wheel moves, this is accommodating any movement on if you like, lateral movement between the wheel steering arm and the actual steering rod. And of course, you know, in a real car, if the suspension is going up and down, this would accommodate that too. So the next thing to do is to push all this together and do some soldering to finish making this part. And as you can see on the end, I've threaded the end there so that you can adjust this with a screwdriver, and that's a typical design for an old type of steering joint, and is often found on many old cars. Well, it's a nice day in the UK, so I thought I'd just come outside to show the latest progress on the Dion truck. Well, as you can see now, the front axle is actually fitted to the vehicle. I've also put the steering rod in and fixed that one. Of course, I've got to do the rod to the steering wheel at some future point, but until I've built the cab and located the steering wheel, I'm just going to park this to one side. So I'll just flip that over. So there's a slightly different view. As you can see on this particular model, the primary leaf spring here is attached to another spring which is fixed to the chassis of the model. So that basically is most of the steering, most of the rolling gear fitted. The next thing that I'll be focusing on is the engine, gearbox and differential, all of which are printed but now need quite extensive detailing in. And of course I've got to fit a subframe, which I have already made, that will actually accommodate the engine and the gearbox. So I'm just going to pause for a second. I'll go and get the rear load deck of the body so that you can have a look at what progress today. So there we go, that's the chassis and rolling gear with the rear body fitted on top. As you can see, it's coming on quite nicely. I could build the front end, but actually I'll probably build that, as I've said. I'm going to do the engine and the gearbox next, get those fitted into the vehicle, and then I'll build the front end, because very often what you find, there'll be some scaling issues and I may have to slightly modify the front end in order to accommodate it on top of the engine and other stuff that's hiding under the body. So watch this space.